Okay. Do you want to start first, Milan, or you just want me to?
Yeah, just go ahead. I think it's 11:05 almost.
Okay. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our seminar today, organized by Harvard Circus. I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Christopher Dantec. And before I continue, at the end of this introduction, I'm going to ask everyone to give a virtual.
नहीं देंगे जहाज पे यही नादरा से चेक करेंगे इस पे स्टैंप लगेगा नादरा में जाके आपको कंफर्म
सफाई सर को लेके जाना है आपको
और मेरा
What's that? I'm going to
Sorry,
repeat.
I just muted. I muted the person. Continue.
So yeah, please share your applause on your webcam or share your applause as a Zoom reaction. Dr. Christopher Dantec is an associate professor with appointments in the School of Interactive Computing, as well as the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. His research is focused on the area of digital civics, where he works with a range of community-based partners to explore new forms of civic participation through community-centered design inquiry at the intersection of participatory design, digital democracy, and smart cities. He is the author of Designing Publics, published in 2016 by MIT Press. And with that, I'm inviting everyone to welcome Dr. Christopher Dantec to present his talk, Mismatches and Seams in Civic Data Infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Herman. Thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here and there and kind of everywhere through all of your screens. So I do want to kind of start off and just talk a little bit about what I mean by digital civics. So the introduction that Herman provided gives a sense of it, and really when I think about what does digital civics look like, it's partly building on this idea of what a smart city might be, where we take sensing and data and analytics, and we apply that to different kinds of city services and operations, right? Doing things to increase efficiency of local government, provide better, say, customer service to people who are coming in and needing services, and to really try to do the work of improving the efficacy of our public institutions, right? And so all of this is kind of churning along how do we take data, which kinds of data do we need, how do we apply it to the way our cities operate. On the other side of that is this idea of digital democracy, right? We're, again, turning to computing. How do we think about the ways that computing can help mediate or facilitate different forms of civic engagement, right? So does it create avenues, or where can it create avenues for direct governance? And how do we think about opportunities for broadening access? So moving past, like, say, the privileged moments of democracy where we go do things like vote, to the everyday encounters with government and governance. What are the kinds of tools that we might want to build out, and how do we get those into people's hands so that they're able to accomplish the kinds of work that they're trying to do? As Herman introduced, like, I do this work in a very participatory way, working with both, on the one hand, community organizations and activists, so kind of people out in the world trying to affect some kind of change, as well as with local government. So the kind of day-to-day operations of how do you just manage a city, and how do you manage the processes that go along with the city. And I do this through kind of three different approaches, right? So one is a very much a design-based approach, where I build different kinds of prototype systems and artifacts to put out into the world to test some ideas about the role of computing and data capture in this space. I do it through empirical work, which is very much based on trying to understand what are the current work practices, particularly around ideas of collaborative work and CSCW, where we're trying to understand how do different enterprise systems kind of function within a city, and then how do different community organizations build up their own capacities to work through different modes of collaboration using technology. And then finally, I kind of try to develop different kinds of theory about this through these design-based and empirical interventions. So kind of some ways that means sitting and staring at the wall and just thinking about it, trying to figure out what the next step might be. and how does it fit within this kind of larger set of work that I engage with in HCI and CSCW. And so, you know, it tends to be that the kinds of things I do look like this, where there's lots of people involved and we're working around a set of issues and trying to figure out and navigate the way we might apply technologies to those issues. And so one of the recent projects that I've been working on has been related to housing justice, right, and developing a set of critical and speculative design interventions that help activists understand how to mobilize and support of eviction intervention. I've worked for several years on a project called Cycle Atlanta, which has been focused on mobility in the city of Atlanta, and how do we collect data about where cyclists go, so really focused on commuters, as well as data about the experiences and the kind of conditions that cyclists encounter as they go through the city. And so this has been really, you know, kind of a data capture and building set of projects. And then finally, I've been working on food security, which is what I'll talk about today. And this is recent work, not in Atlanta, but in Albany, and trying to understand what are the intersections between a community coalition that's trying to address food security in their city, and then the kinds of services and technologies that the city has that can be brought to bear on this issue. Most of the work that I do is focused in Atlanta, but recently I've been working more broadly across the state of Georgia and trying to understand how some of these kind of smart and connected community types of projects look in rural places and less dense places, kind of where many of the assumptions of the smart city as being dense and urban kind of start to fall apart, and you have to have a different set of considerations, both in terms of kind of capacities and resources within local government, but also expectations and visibilities and accountabilities of the communities around those local governments. And all of this, you know, and thinking about kind of you all as an audience and the relationship that I have to you and you have to me in terms of, I don't build automated systems, but a lot of the work that I do, particularly around kind of community data collection, gets pulled into automated systems or becomes a kind of precursor for discussions about where does automation fit in these kinds of processes in terms of identifying opportunities, identifying new ways of addressing issues that kind of take place across kind of time and space within cities. So today I want to talk about food security, and particularly the intersection between a community data initiative where different groups within the city kind of got together or had already gotten together to address issues of food security, and wanted to turn their knowledge about the lived experience of being food insecure into something that could help both steer policy at the government level, but also provide guidance to kind of nonprofit and for-profit private organizations that were trying to address kind of food distribution in the city. This kind of came in contact with city-run infrastructure. So the city itself had a large enterprise platform that was built out in it. So I guess there's no reason to hide it, but it was they were running on ArcGIS, and there was a new set of features that ArcGIS had provided called the Hub, which allowed for kind of the opening up of these services and capabilities to the community members. And the whole idea of the project was to say, well, the city is super invested in this technology platform to manage not just their geospatial data, right, the data of land parcels and where things are in the city, but kind of a lot of the operational data was being pulled into the system. What would it mean to then open that up and bring in kind of opportunities for community groups to both use those data sets and those capabilities, but also provide an avenue to kind of collecting or introducing new forms of data into city operations. And then finally, to really look at how all of this started to unfold as a civic collaboration, right? So how do different groups both kind of organizationally work together? How do individuals attach to that? And what does it mean to take kind of a community-born initiative, a community set of concerns, and run them through kind of public data or public civic infrastructure in a way that provides new capabilities, but what are some of the boundaries and the seams there? So all of this is taking place or took place in the city of Albany, Georgia. So if you're not familiar with Georgia at that level, it's a small town in the southwest part of the state. It is the home, it's the birthplace of Ray Charles, and they have this wonderful rotating bronze statue of Ray Charles on the Flint River, and a beautiful walk. So you can go and listen to his music while he slowly turns around. The city itself is kind of a center or a hub of a lot of agricultural industry in the area. It had been previously the home to several different large manufacturing and government installations. So there was a large, I believe, Navy munitions manufacturing site there. Those have since shut down, and over the past decade or more, really the city's kind of been struggling through a post-industrial collapse of its own, where there's a lot of poverty and low income. And really, one of the things that the city itself was trying to grapple with is addressing all of the attendant struggles that small rural communities are facing when there's not the same economic base to it for its residents. But more than that, there's a longer history, particularly of food security in the area, because going back through the 60s, in the civil rights movement, one of the things that kind of also came out of Albany was the birth of what was called the Albany movement. And so this was really a combination of work that happened through the local university, which is now called Albany State University, and local activists in the area really gave birth to the nonviolent tactics of the civil rights movement. So it's kind of a hidden civil rights connection here. And one of the things that came out of that was what the first public land trust that was established to support Black farmers in the area as they were working, again, for food security and to preserve their farming and kind of local cultural practices. And so there's this history of addressing food security and addressing social and racial justice in Albany that gets carried forward to today as the city continues to try to address these issues, and issues that are, still very much felt along racial lines in the area. And before I get into some of the other pieces, I do want to kind of also provide a little bit more context on what do we mean by food security. So, there's some sense of, well, we know that there are food deserts, but what we're looking at here is more than just kind of access to the store. We're trying to get a much better sense of what kinds of food do you have access to. So it's not enough to say, well, there's a bodega down the road. Are there fresh fruits and vegetables there? What is the price of the food that's available? So kind of questions that go beyond just the kind of bold, the binary of do you have access or not, but really trying to get into a way of coloring that access in a way that provides more insight into what those experiences look like for residents across the city. So this feeds into the kinds of data needs that we were trying to address, right? So when we started to work with the city and the local university there, we started to piece together, okay, who do we need to work with, and what are the opportunities for doing a kind of a research project that sits at this intersection of a set of community groups working to address a local issue and a set of resources that the city might have to be able to share and open up to those community groups. And so we worked with, started with Albany State and a researcher there, and then kind of started to expand the number of groups that we were working with the local food bank, with small businesses who are trying to address innovative ways of food distribution. So like a small mobile food truck that was providing groceries to residents. So instead of bringing you prepared food, it was bringing fresh fruits and vegetables. Working with other advocacy and policy groups that were active in the area, trying to address food security, both in Albany, but also in the surrounding area around it. And as we started to have conversations with these groups to understand both what they were doing and also where their needs were, particularly around data, we realized that it was very much this idea of what does food security look like in the area and what data are currently available. And at the time, what was available from USDA was this idea of like, well, here's our food desert map. And it turns out that most of Albany looks like a food desert, in part because the granularity of the data is such that it just misses the kind of neighborhood by neighborhood experience of what it means to have food. And like many rural places, the city itself has a small downtown and somewhat dense kind of core. But most of the kinds of stores are, big box stores that are at the periphery, kind of in between, a historic downtown area and the suburbs. And so there's not a lot of smaller opportunities for food. And so really what we wanted to do was understand really neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, what does food access look like? Recognizing that there's a whole set of intersectional issues here around transportation, kind of health of the community, age of the community, and the way that people move around the city. And so in doing this, we catalyzed a Civic Coalition to address the gaps. Right, so this included the city of Albany and their IT group. It included Albany State, both faculty and students there, the local advocacy groups that I mentioned, food banks, farmers. Right, so we had a steering committee of about 15 people that were local to Albany that were helping guide the purpose and the goals of the research. There was a core research team from my lab of 3 people that were providing a lot of the technology support and building out of pieces. There was a couple of people in the city of Albany who were really focused on doing the kind of city side of the technology management, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And then we had over 150 volunteers over the course of the year collecting data as we went out to try to understand in very specific detail what it looked like in the city. Right, and so a year ago, I guess it was February of 2020 at this point, we had a large data collection workshop where we built out some technologies on the city's platform to collect data and do a store census of Albany. And this was the last big public event of the year. We just got underway, and then what ended up happening is instead of doing a series of these large data collection days to cover the entire city, we ended up doing a lot more individual work where volunteers took the app, the mobile interface to collect data and do the store census, and did so kind of through the later parts of the summer and early fall, so that we had coverage on the entire city. That coverage was about 150 stores that we had surveyed. So residents or the volunteers went in, looked for the types of food, the cost of those food types, and then recorded those into what was a database in Arcgis, so that we could see and grade and kind of build a metric of what food access looked like. Right, and so as I've been saying, this has all been built and integrated on city data infrastructure. And what this enabled us to do was kind of 2 things. So one, it gave us access to the data city had to identify stores and locations that we wanted to go and sense. Now, building on tax data, so basically it's an intersection of tax data as well as parcel data, as well as utility data. So like many small cities, at least in Georgia, the city runs its own utility. So like in Atlanta, the utility is a private firm, and trying to get data out of them about anything is kind of an impossibility. But in Albany, because it's a small city that runs its own utilities, they have access to say, okay, well, we can actually go through and do this analysis that says, here's the parcel data, here the business, the tax address data, and then we can verify based on recent utility activity if that business still existed. And so it gave us a very good way to understand kind of the current situation in the city for the different food and food related businesses, and then build up a data set that said, here are the locations that we need to go out and look at. And doing this, though, the flip side of this was that as we went and did this store census, all of that data was going back into the same system. So now the city had access to a new set of data that described things that were going on in the city, and also the kind of economic consequences of those things in terms of what kinds of food and what kinds of prices were being made available in different neighborhoods. And so this was really the part of that experiment that the city wanted to run as they opened up their technology platform, was looking at, if we share our operational data and we then get access to new kinds of data, does that become a richer bed to sow different kinds of analyses and turn some kinds of decisions into almost just operational, because now it exists within that platform in which operational decisions are being made. Right, and so this enabled the coalition to bring back these new kinds of data. It also provided a set of capabilities to the community groups to do the data collection, to present the data back spatially, things that they weren't currently doing, even though there are, a myriad of open source and kind of free tools to do that. They require different kinds of skills than what was available in the ArcGIS Hub platform that gave them access to doing some things were made easy while other things were made hard. And I'll talk about that a bit too. So this is kind of what we did, right? This is the big picture of all the things that were going on. And the intersection here is that the city was trying to test this process of working through both what does it mean to enable the community to use this platform that they manage, but also what would it mean for the kind of policies and procedures. So this is going beyond like an open data initiative that would say, here are our data sets, or here's an API to get to our data sets, to really saying, let's work on the same technology platform together, right? So it's an important distinction because it introduces a whole set of other kinds of constraints beyond the typical complications of providing data. And the food security initiative, like the coalition of community groups working together, were engaged in this because they really wanted to have new access to data, and they wanted support in developing those data sets so that they could continue kind of advance their own agenda. So there's a couple of different agendas going on here, and my research team, we were the glue between all of it. So we were doing this translation work between what the community groups wanted in terms of data collection and building resources, and between what the city wanted in terms of testing and understanding how their platform might be used if it were opened up as a more public resource. And so this is the work of collaboration, right? So it was the work of managing people, of managing the data that got produced, and of managing the process. And so kind of stepping a bit away from the details and the nitty-gritty of food security and the data that we collected, I want to talk a little bit about kind of how these different pieces came together through the technology platform. And what's important to keep in mind is that the ArcGIS platform is very much an enterprise piece of software. It is designed for large organizations to manage their data and do sophisticated geospatial management and analysis. It is not meant to be or certainly hasn't been designed to be kind of a mass market piece of technology, right? It's a specialized tool that has its own kind of legacy of choices and kind of interaction idioms and expectations. But it lives within this world of a city trying to manage its data. And so the very first piece of this work was managing people. And this is something that the city had to do, right? And by managing people here, I don't mean telling individuals what they need to do. I mean, very much, how do you turn people into objects in this enterprise system so that those people can then go and do their work, right? So and the tension here was that we needed to create a set of accounts, and those accounts needed to have a set of permissions, and those permissions would enable a kind of access to the data sets that the city was sharing for the purpose of this project, to the features within the platform that enabled the kinds of analysis that the members of the coalition wanted to do, and then also being able to create content and share that analysis out, right? So there's kind of a whole set of things that all gets tied to the accounts. Now, if any of you, and I understand in the setup for today that many of you work in situations where you're working with community organizations on different kinds of problems, you'll know, or at least have some, hopefully some recognition that often community groups and small community organizations are very fluid and kind of precarious places where someone comes in and does a job on one day and they're there for a little while and maybe they move on or maybe they take on a different role. And so this idea of a person and a job being kind of connected together doesn't always hold up in the more kind of fluid and informal setting of a community group or informal activist organization. And so this is one of the first places where we start to see some of the mismatch between the way the system itself needed to understand and address and kind of account for the individuals working on the data and collecting data and producing content, and the way it actually happens in practice when you have a set of volunteers that come in and out, when you have a different set of expertise sits across people differently in these informal organizations than it does in kind of the way you would kind of imagine an enterprise organization. So pulling all of this through then, right, we've got to manage people, but now we need to manage data, right? And to manage data, we're right back to the end of managing people. We need access, but then the data needs to be visible to different sets of people in different ways. And then there's questions of ownership, right? So when data gets collected and produced and is put into the system, who owns it? And the ownership question ended up being probably the most difficult to navigate. And it was difficult to navigate because it traces back through the managing people piece, right? It was clear that the city owned certain data sets, right? So the parcel data was owned by the city, the utilities data was owned by the city, the tax data came through the city. But data that was produced through the course of the census taking, it was less clear how that ownership was going to play out because of where it was ending up, right? The data was coming into this city-owned platform, but was it owned by Albany State, who was the lead local organization, or was it owned by the volunteers who produced it and submitted it? And that ownership question comes into play because of the boundaries between what the city might want to do in response to food security and what the coalition of community groups might want to do. And what would happen if the city decides to take away those user accounts, right? Or shut them down or change the access. And so kind of tracing back through when we have this single platform, what does it mean to provide access? And then how does that access get managed, particularly over time, right? Everyone recognized that what we were working on was a pretty short-term project that had, very clear research goals, but also very clear kind of real life impact and a desire to turn something over back to the community that they could manage on their own. And so how do we manage both the people and the data in a way that would allow for a sustainable and kind of long-term engagement with the effort that went in to get to the point that we did? And where the city had to manage the user accounts, like that was clearly a task and a thing that the city had to do, the food security group was really interested in managing the data. And so again, there's these kind of two layers where the city is has to take care of this base layer of kind of enterprise software management. And then people that aren't associated with the city necessarily have to do the layer of actually the work of managing the data and pulling it together and analyzing it and creating kind of communication artifacts with those data. And so this in turn led to trying to manage the process. So again, with process, we're starting with ownership. Who owns the data? Who owns responsibility for collecting more data, for updating it, for expanding the kinds of data or the kinds of things that we wanted to include? What does accountability look like here? So the city has a certain set of accountabilities as a public institution. It has certain responsibilities in terms of how it keeps, archives, warehouses data that it owns because of its accountability to the public in that regard, which looks different than community groups. And so this lands us on this question of autonomy and how do these different organizations work in a collaborative way while kind of maintaining their autonomy. And so like this is kind of the point to land on, is looking at these different kind of attributes that need to be managed, right? We start with the user accounts that have to be created and the permissions that have to be associated with them and how that lands us on access. But then that access has immediate impact on the visibility of data, right? Which then leads to this question of ownership, who owns it, and the accountabilities and the autonomies that are enabled, kind of tracing back through. And what I want to pull through here is that each of these kind of live in their own space, right? So managing accounts lives in kind of a city space, managing the data lives in kind of this collaborative space, and then thinking about the impact of those on the way different groups can maintain their autonomy lands kind of at the end as a result of these different interferences. And going back to the beginning of this, we talked about wanting to support collaboration and the way the city could collaborate with community groups, or way the community groups could collaborate with the city. And I think this is part of the challenge, is that collaboration kind of happens under some notion of either a kind of a shared logic around what the goals of a task are, or what the goals of an organization might be, where in this case, I think coalition is probably the better way to think about it, where it's not just about, can we get to an end result that we agree on, but there are going to be moments where we agree and think that, kind of have a shared goal. And then there's going to be moments where we don't, and we need to be able to move back and forth and with some flexibility, but also recognizing that in the civic space, one of the ways things get done is through friction, it's through contention, it's through arguing. And it's not always a kind of productive working together, it's often a productive working apart. And so if we think about these kinds of systems, right, civic technologies that are meant to be places where different groups come together, imagining them as being kind of collaborative in the enterprise sense of collaboration really puts a set of stresses on the way groups tend to work together and kind of want to work together, right? A community group may want to keep their own data, in part because that data becomes kind of rhetorically and politically powerful in their ability to argue for a given outcome, or to even shape the way a problem is framed, right? If they give that up and that moves into a technology space that they do not have control over, what do they lose in that process? Right? And so the kind of punchline that I'm coming to here is that seams matter, right? And so the seams between organizations are really important. And I think one of the things that we're trying to continue to work through, both in my lab and in the projects that I've got going on across kind of the state at this point, is that often when we think about the smart city, it's about data integration, right? And so in another version of a talk, I talk about I use sand as a metaphor for data. And so like, well, okay, sand is kind of everywhere, imagine a beach, right? It's springtime now, everyone's ready for a change in the weather. So data is to the city what sand is to the beach. It's just kind of there, it is the material of the thing. And when we think about the smart city, we think about the integration of all of this into some kind of elaborate, wonderful structure, a beautiful sandcastle that you can kind of imagine as being this ideal version of a smart city. But in practice, the way cities operate is that those data live in different silos. They're partial, they're crumbling, they're always about to be washed away by the tide that's coming through, or someone who's going to not notice it and trip over it and destroy it. And I think, in fact, the thing that we need to be designing for is that precarity of the data sets, and that precarity of the way different organizations kind of want to keep that separation, that the integration in fact works against how cities and how communities kind of interact with each other to get things done. And that we can shift, and the way that years ago in ubiquitous computing, there was a move to think about seamful design, where instead of trying to create kind of seamful data infrastructure, so think about your Wi-Fi signal or your 5G now signal, and walking to the end of it and then losing signal meant that you couldn't do some things. But if you and the idea being that we need to fix that breakdown was something that we don't want. But it also became an affordance for certain kinds of interactions, and it became a way to, if we turn our metaphor and say, well, let's design for seams instead of trying to get rid of them, it changed how we thought about system design. And I think the same kind of move needs to be brought up in terms of civic design and digital civics, because the way organizations kind of maintain their own integrity is by managing those boundaries and choosing how different parts of their, their material, whether it's data or human resources, move between those boundaries. And so as we think about kind of the ecosystem of digital technologies that operate in the civic space or in the public space, how do we design for those seams so that we can maintain that autonomy and so that we can maintain those data ownerships in a way that enable that kind of political movement in the small p, small m sense to affect change locally. So I think that's what I want to say about this for now. I'm happy to have more discussions with all of you. Hopefully I've left plenty of time to talk through some of your own experiences and the projects that you have, and some of the challenges, further talk about the challenges and the details of what I've been doing here. And I will say you all are lucky. This was the first time I've had a chance to talk about this. It's still very recent work.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing the fresh work with us. Before we move to the question and answer session, I just want to share a couple of events that's happening at Circus. Okay, how do I share screen?
Here, I think I can release my screen if I can find my mouse.
All right.
There we go.
Right, perfect. Yeah, so in the spirit of Public Health Week, we at Harvard Circus is hosting an expert panel asking the question of what is the role of AI in health equity, with panelists Harvard Maddy from Harvard School of Public Health, David Jones from Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and then Nathaniel Hendricks from Harvard School of Public Health. The event will be virtual and it will happen on Wednesday, April 7 from 3:30 to 5 p.m. And you can register by going to this link on the bottom left corner. And then we have another series of events called Rising Star for AI for Social Good. And we have four different themes. This week is conservation, and then in 2 weeks will be fairness and technology. And wait, where did my screen go? Technology and society. And then if you you're interested to join, you can also sign up by going to the link on the bottom left corner over there. Thank you. And again, thank you again for Chris for sharing your research. And we have the first question from Millen. Millen, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So I guess I actually have two questions, if I may. First is evaluation of food security done on an absolute scale of some type? Say, for example, for all of the US, it's the same, or is it relative to some local context? So that's question one. And question two is, assuming that you're recruiting these volunteers for the city of Albany to collect data, are they all equally eager and effective in collecting data? Do you have to adjust for the fact that some, for whatever reason, may not be able to collect data, may not grade food security the same way? So I guess first question is about absolute versus relative scale on food security. The second is absolute versus relative scale on the volunteers.
Yeah, so for the first question, the survey that we deployed was based on I'm going to forget the name of it now. The acronym is NEMS. It was a standard instrument that was developed at Penn State. And it's a really long survey that looks at what does food availability look like in a given place. And so we shortened it a bit for the local context based on kind of working with our local partners to say, what are the things that are in fact available and what are the things that we're going to be looking at? And we put that into a feature called Survey 123 in Arcgis. So it became a standard form that the volunteers could use to go and survey the locations. So to answer the second question first, we didn't feel, I think the efficacy of a volunteer was more about how many stores might they actually get to, and not about the data that they produced on a given store, because it was a straightforward survey mechanism. In terms of the metric, because we were using this, basing things on a standard instrument, there's a connection to a nationwide kind of understanding. But again, the partner at Albany State created a metric that was more locally based to understand the differences within the city, because it was really about local policy and not kind of local policy in relation to national policy. And so some of the things that they were looking at beyond just stores was they also wanted to look at, or they added later on, looking at restaurants, because I think one of the local things that was happening as they were working through trying to address food security as well as economic development kind of hand in hand, was that they would, the city would say, well, we recognize that this neighborhood needs better food access. Let's put a restaurant there. Let's enable the zoning decision to have a new restaurant. But that restaurant might be soul food, or it might be fast food, or it might be some other food option that, again, when taken in consideration of food security, not just in terms of do you have access, but do you have access to healthy food? These were the kinds of local things that the group was trying to understand and have some say in. And I would also add, so since this is Public Health Awareness Week, one of the things that became, so going into this question of food security, we knew that food security has a big impact on health outcomes. One of the things that the past year just underscored, tragically in Albany, was that they're really bad health outcomes kind of across the board in that region. So early on in the pandemic, Albany was a hotspot, kind of per capita impacted at the level of like New York City. And so really, like, largely community just really decimated over the past year, given the conditions. And so the urgency of trying to understand not just food access, but here's what it means in terms of kind of survivability and mortality rates and during the pandemic really became a part of the conversation that wasn't something that any of us kind of foresaw. Like, none of us foresaw any of this year. But
I have a question for Chris, but if anyone in the audience want to ask a question first, you can go ahead. It's interesting. I saw that there were multiple stakeholders working on this project, and I was wondering how did this collaboration emerge? Like, how did it started? And the second part is, I'm wondering what is the harm if we're just collaborating with one organization? Like, what if we just collaborate with the government organization, or we just collaborate with one community organization?
So some of the groups were working together already. So there was a food justice coalition that existed, that was being run by a regional nonprofit, a policy based on, so they were looking to develop policy responses. So, what we did is, coming in, especially coming in from Atlanta, like, there's a whole set of, like, we're not from here, so how do we connect with local groups? And so we really relied on our partners at Albany State and in the city to help us identify who we might work with. We were really intentional in working with the range of collaborators, so not just the city or not just that one existing group, because one, we felt that food security required understanding kind of as many of the different moving parts as we could. So we wanted food retailers as a part of it. We wanted the food bank, who's dealing with kind of day-to-day distribution and maybe not on some of the policy pieces. We wanted local farmers who were trying to, reimagine urban farming within the city and distribution that way, so that we were getting both the kind of economic development piece that goes along with some of this, as well as the kind of impact and distribution piece, as well as the policy piece. And, I don't know that I wouldn't say that there's like a pat answer for why you would want to work with more than one organization or not. I think it kind of comes down to, what are you trying to achieve? And also, like, what is your stomach for managing all those different organizations, right? Because the more you add in, the more difficult it becomes. But I think for the purpose of this project, where the city was trying to understand how do we support community groups working with our data sets and our resources through this platform, having multiple groups was actually really critical, because that's what started to show the challenges around managing all of this in an enterprise kind of environment when it's not in fact an enterprise. I think if we had just worked with one group, it would have been really straightforward to say, oh, we've set up your user accounts and your access and it's fine. But instead we had, 5 or 6 different groups effectively, and volunteers and individuals across each of those moving in and out. And so there was honestly a large stack of just how do you do the user management? Like, just talk to your IT staff. Like, if you're trying to constantly update user accounts or create new ones or deactivate ones from people that have left and change, that by itself, is mundane as it is, becomes a huge headache for trying to make an effective use of technology in this kind of setting.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So very briefly, I just wanted to say that this issue of data limitations has come up repeatedly in the seminar series. And thank you again for highlighting that, because it's clearly something very important, dealing with data, because normally in the AI for social impact work, it's sort of assumed that data is there, and then you're sort of innovating on the algorithmic side. But the amount of effort needed to collect data itself is really important to highlight. I was wondering, where would you, if we wanted to sort of highlight these kinds of issues just from a very academic perspective, where do you end up publishing this kind of work? It wouldn't be easily publishable in an AI setting.
Right. So the places that I tend to publish at CSCW, so Computer Supported Collaborative Work, and I think that's a nice venue because you do have a mix of, say, folks who are innovating on kind of, let's just operate on the data that exists in different ways, as well as people who, more like me, are doing kind of the human-centered empirical approaches that are trying to situate some of these practices back into the way organizations work. Clearly, there's also a lot of work that happens in this space in STS, right? So I think that's kind of, as a discipline anyway, that would be a place to look.
Sorry, what is STS?
What is it? Social studies of technology, basically. So it's social sciences and technology. So 4S is one of the conferences. I'm blanking on the name of the main journal right now. But it's, it again looks a lot like some of the things that happen at CSCW, where it's, people who have looked at knowledge practices around technology. So Janet Fertesi at Princeton and David Rubez at University of Washington have their work I've most recently been familiar with and know them well. They've looked at science practices. So Janet's largely looking at how different teams at NASA manage data collection and collaboration across different kind of rover and exploratory vehicles. And so in a similar sense, she talks about seams and how different science teams have expectations of their data and expectations of how they get to use instruments. And they're constantly negotiating between themselves for that as they produce knowledge. And I think there's some really nice analogies to that kind of seamful work, that how do we think about civic organizations in that same way, where they're producing knowledge and using data in whatever instrument that they have in their own ways, and then trying to make sense around that and kind of collaborate around that.
I have a question. There's like a concern that in like doing community-based research, it's well, not exactly community, but like there's a lot of research that's focused on the deficits in the community, and that can perpetuate negative perception about the community, and then also like reproduce the cycle of dependencies of external help. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on how do you be mindful of that and reducing that risk happening in research.
So, I mean, one of the ways that you address that is to move from a deficit model to an asset model. So there's a whole set of work in kind of the like, I guess it's community building and outreach. So called asset-based research. So I think it's what's ABC, asset-based development. And what that does is instead of coming into a place and saying, okay, here's what you're missing, or here's what's broken, and here's what we need to fix. You start by saying, okay, what's in place already that we can start to work with? And then from there, it becomes a question of how do we amplify the things that are already going on in a way that would help, accelerate a desired outcome or enable some new thing to happen. And so this has been, I guess, this is part of how we arrived at such a large number of collaborators as well in Albany, is because we started to say, okay, well, if food security is a problem, what's already happening here to address it? And who do we talk to? Who do we start to work with to understand what they're doing and how, a new set of technical capabilities might help them do what they're doing. I think we could have easily just worked with the city and said, okay, food security is a problem. Let's go solve it, or let's go treat it as an issue. And from that deficit model. And then that might have said, well, here's where, maybe that says, well, here's where you need to place more stores, right? Or here are some things that you need to do to stop food security. But I think had we done that, given the conversation that we had, it would have kind of stopped at the level of access and not gotten into the idea of kinds of access. That the conversation around kinds of access really came from working with people who were already addressing the issue of food security and knew what kinds of interventions were working locally. And so then it was a question of, well, if this is working, what do you need to know to help, extend what you're doing, or where do you feel your limits or your barriers are?
I'm just writing that down. Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So my question is about funding, and given that you've really sort of laid out a complex undertaking with lots of partners, and I can imagine as well during COVID shifting from in-person to moving to individual work, it probably adds a bunch of time to what is already a time-consuming and people-intensive project. Can you talk about funding for this project and any wisdom you can share about setting that up, especially because when you do collaborative work, you have to have those partnerships, and that takes time to really even figure out who's doing what in some of these, some of the already existing collaborations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so funding is always the challenge. And so there's, I guess, so this project was funded by Esri, by the vendor that makes ArcGIS. So part of that was, what made that nice is that they provided some technical support as well that would have been beyond the scope of what we could have done just on our own, and kind of support that was tied more to like the business model of software as a service than to kind of the nuts and bolts of pulling things together. But I think the question is, so funding is one piece, but also the time horizon. And I think this is something that I run into, COVID or not, is that often the kinds of funding that typically circulates specifically kind of in CS circles or in HCI circles doesn't always understand the timescales that community-based work requires, because there's a long ramp up to a new project, and there's also a long ramp down once a project finishes. Right, you can't just kind of disappear, and so I don't have an answer other than to say that it's a constant struggle. And but it's a worthwhile struggle. It's just one that it takes a lot of planning. And I think the other piece of this, kind of almost going back to this question of like asset-based research, is that it also requires being upfront with your community partners and saying, okay, here's what this looks like. So there's a kind of transparency that we bring to the table when we work with groups to say, well, this is what the funding situation is. These are the things that we know we can cover. These are the things that we're going to have to kind of piece together through, maybe our own kind of in-kind voluntary work on an ongoing basis, right? So, for example, the project in Albany, like it was supposed to have concluded last July formally, but of course that continued to December, and we thought we'd done the handoff with our partners in Albany of all the technology pieces, and we'd held several trainings, but we're in fact still, kind of weekly, daily, stepping in to help with things, and we knew that was going to happen. But now it's, at some point you do have to pull the Band-Aid off. And so we're trying to figure out what the best way to do that is. And I think one of the challenges with the Albany project is that the city has repeatedly said, hey, we'll take care of, any service requests you have. If you have trouble with user accounts, like we're happy to take care of it. The challenge is that one, it's one person at the city who does this, and she's already got an enormous set of responsibilities. But also just that kind of organizational and political relationship that these groups have with the city is that, do they want to be constantly running back to the city to say, oh, fix this, when maybe they're just going to stop using the technology, or they're not sure if they rightly have access to these things because the formal project has concluded. So these are the kind of mundane research logistical challenges that we're constantly trying to figure out, and every situation has proved to be different. So we get to keep solving them.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, that's great, because my next question was going to be about sustainability, and if you had ideas about what would happen after the project as you were planning and sort of in before, and if that was different in actuality.
I think we know at this point that we need to have a plan for handoff right away. And so we try to identify individual, like as we're working with groups, like individuals who have the skills and the interest to carry it forward. And so there was, but then also that runs into this reality of people move on. So while we were doing the project, there was a woman who was, she worked at a local business, and she had ArcGIS experience. She was like, that's what she did. And she was volunteering, working with the Food Justice Coalition, and she was going to be our person to kind of take the reins. But then she moved, right? And so, you to the best you can, you kind of like plan out like identify where different parts of the project might live and how they can be sustained. And I think doing that from the beginning, so that it's not like in my lab, we're going to do all this stuff and then hand it to you and it's done. It's like, oh, we're doing it together the whole way through, so that there's no mystery, there's no surprise kind of package at the end. Like, oh, what is this present? It's like, oh, everyone's worked on the project all the way through and knows how it works, and then it has a natural home. But again, that uncertainty and the volatility of turnover and staff and people involved just mean that at some point it's going to be a surprise for somebody.